Welcome to our webinar. This is Green Century Funds in Green America, and then also a guest from the Public Interest Research Group's webinar on greening your investments. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to those of you on the East Coast for spending your lunch hour with us. I'm in the middle of the country, so I suppose it's a late breakfast for me. And if you're on the West Coast, thanks for starting your day with us. We are going to spend the next hour or so on the topic of greening your investments. And we have a terrific panel assembled to go through this webinar and hopefully give you some great information that you can take with us. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. And if we can move to the next slide, please. Our panelists here today are Leslie Samuelrich, president of the Green Century Funds, Fran Teplitz, executive co-director for business, investing, and policy for Green America, and Matt Casale, who runs the environment campaigns at the Public Interest Research Groups, or PIRGs. My name is Gigi Norcross, and I also am a member of the Green Century Funds team, vice president for business development. Between the four of us, we have decades of experience in environmental advocacy and sustainable investing. And so, as I say, I hope that you get a lot from the content that we're going to cover today. And for myself, as a relative newcomer to this space, I feel like I am in the presence of giants. So on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Matt, who is going to take us through the first part of our webinar, which is to really lay out the problem of climate change and why go fossil fuel free in the first place. So Matt, on that note, why don't I hand the mic over to you?
Thanks, Gigi. Really happy to be here today. As Gigi said, I'm Matt Casale. I'm PIRG's Environment Campaigns Director. PIRG, or the Public Interest Research Group, is an advocate for the public interest. We speak out for a healthier world in which we're freer to pursue our own individual well-being and the common good. And climate change clearly falls within that. Climate change is one of the challenges, if not the challenge of our times. Next slide, please. And you can see here a quote from a recent report from the International Panel on Climate Change, which is a United Nations established body. Let's see, my camera's being fun here. Hopefully this is better. A United Nations established body to assess the science of climate change. The IPCC wrote, I think hard to put it better than this, our choices will reverberate for hundreds, even thousands of years. That means what we do today will determine the world that that we leave to our children and our grandchildren. The IPCC recently highlighted the importance of acting urgently, meaning we need to act now, but remain clear that we still have an opportunity to make a difference. So you go to the next slide. Here's what they mean. This chart shows the pathways to limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which is the scientific consensus of what we need to do to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And I'll note it's looking increasingly likely that we will surpass 1.5 degrees and there will be serious impacts. But I want to emphasize that that's not the end, and that's not the end of the world. 3 or 4 degrees is a lot worse than 2 degrees, is a lot worse than 1.7 degrees, is a lot worse than 1.5 degrees. So every bit that we limit warming, the better off we are. And so this chart shows different scenarios. What will happen if we continue on our current trajectory versus what will happen if we aggressively implement policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Under the current implemented policies, you can see that the models show we're on track to limit warming to somewhere between 2.2 and 3.5 degrees, which is not great. We need to do better. And you know, within that range, depending on how well the policies are implemented. The faster that we can get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, however, the greater chance we have of limiting warming below those levels and even preventing warming above 2 degrees or if we're really fast above 1.5 degrees. But you can see that to get there, we definitely need more aggressive action. Next slide. So why then have we not taken more aggressive action? Well, the fossil fuel industry is massive and powerful, and it's raking in a lot of money. Here goes my camera again. I apologize. You can see from this chart here that we're still financing fossil fuels to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year, even though we know we need to phase down our use of fossil fuels to prevent the worst effects of climate change. Fossil fuel companies not only play an outsized role in causing the emissions that are driving the climate problem, but they also play an outsized role in preventing policies to implement climate solutions. Fossil fuel lobbying and public misinformation campaigns over the years have been responsible for slowing or killing many proposed policies that could have had us making much faster progress toward net zero emissions. So continuing to finance these companies at these levels allows them to continue doing all of that and puts us at risk of not being able to achieve the emissions reductions we need or to reach net zero fast enough to prevent the worst effects of climate change.
Great, thanks, Matt. I should have noted at that outset that we will be able to take questions throughout this webinar. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. We will incorporate some answers into the presentations themselves. We will pose some questions throughout the webinar, and then we've got time reserved at the end for covering any questions that we didn't get to. And we love the interaction so far. So thanks for your participation. Matt, I actually have one question for you. Oh, and then somebody asked if you'll get the slides. There will be a recording of this webinar made available to everybody in attendance. And so we'll answer that one just right off the bat. Matt, you were talking a bit about fossil fuel industry blocking efforts to reduce fossil fuels. Can you talk a little bit about some specifics and what you're seeing from your advocacy vantage point?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the public messaging that has been problematic specifically. One thing we're starting to see is a lot more corporations across sectors setting climate-related or emissions-related goals or net zero goals, including fossil fuel companies. But when you sort of peel back the curtain on some of those commitments, the fear is that it amounts mostly to, what we would call greenwashing, meaning it's a commitment without much teeth. It doesn't play into their business practices. And in fact, if you look at some of the projections from fossil fuel companies, they're still planning on increasing their production and increasing their emissions over time. And, one example of sort of the public message around this, I was in Houston about a year ago, and there's a huge billboard in Houston from a major fossil fuel company that said, and this is just a billboard in the city has a lot of highways, so it was on a highway, but that said, carbon capture, utilization, and storage is our only way to meet emissions goals, which is just not true, right? Reducing the amount of fossil fuels that we produce and actually reducing the amount of emissions that are produced by switching to cleaner transportation, by switching to renewable energy sources, by switching to electrified buildings. That's the best way to reduce emissions, not by producing those emissions and then hoping we can utilize some unproven technology that's really still unproven to end up capturing and taking those out of the atmosphere. And then the other example I'll give is the long-standing campaign by the gas industry to portray methane gas, which is generally called natural gas, which is part of the marketing effort, as a clean and sustainable option, when in fact we know that the climate impact of the methane from producing, leaking, and burning natural gas is actually really, really significant, and that gets very much downplayed in the marketing. We're still told gas is clean burning, and gas is an important part of our the process to reducing emissions, when in fact it's actually really harmful.
Great, thank you very much. So Matt's laid out the problem of global warming and the challenges that we see, and how fossil fuels play a role in that, and fossil fuel industry plays a role in that. From that, I want to pivot it to Fran and to Leslie to talk about, to address this more from a solutions point of view. There are plenty of solutions to the problems that Matt was laying out. What we are focusing in on this webinar is how aligning your investments with your environmental concerns and values, it can make a difference and be one thing that we do. So on that, I will turn things over to Fran.
Thank you very much. Again, Fran Teplitz, Executive Co-Director at Green America. We're a national leader in advancing and building the green economy. So I'm very pleased to address the moral case for fossil fuel divestment, the growth of the fossil fuel divestment movement, and how you can align your banking, whether through a bank or a credit union, with the needs of both people and the planet. Next slide. So, as people concerned about the impacts of our money, our starting point for how we invest is grounded in our values. And we understand that ROI, return on investment, is never limited to just financial returns. The returns we reap also include social and environmental outcomes. We own those returns just as we own financial profit or loss. The failure to recognize this broader definition of returns is at the heart of many poor investment decisions, poor in that they do not serve investors, communities, and the planet over the long term. More and more people are seeking sustainable, responsible investments because they want to meet their financial goals while upholding their commitments to social justice and to preserving what remains of our environmental heritage. There are long-standing faith-based traditions that examine the connection between wealth and our obligations to society. There are many political movements that have advanced divestment strategies on moral grounds, including divestment from apartheid South Africa, Sudan, and the fossil fuel industry. Key moral issues related to fossil fuel divestment include the insight from climate leader Bill McKibben, who said that if it's wrong to wreck the climate, it's wrong to profit from that wreckage. Moreover, how can we condone the pursuit of profit from fossil fuels that bring the most dire consequences to those least responsible, who emit the lowest amount of greenhouse gases, who use the least fossil fuels? As the Archbishop Armagh in Ireland stated, climate change is already having a disproportionate impact on those who are on the margins, those who are dependent on fragile ecosystems and most vulnerable to famine, to drought, to food and water insecurity, and to conflict, to exploitative and predatory economic interests, to the destruction of their homes and displacement of their families. Indigenous communities also have knowledge and leadership that are crucial to reversing the climate crisis and to protecting human rights. As Tom Goldtooth and Tamara Gilbertson of the Indigenous Environmental Network have written, strategies for system change must center Indigenous people's sovereignty and rights and must begin by keeping fossil fuels in the ground. The moral price is real. and politically powerful. As the University of Oxford stated back in 2013, the outcome of the stigmatization process, which the fossil fuel divestment campaign has now triggered, poses the most far-reaching threat to fossil fuel companies and the vast energy value chain. So we're having an impact. Divestment movement is working. Next slide. Recognizing the moral imperative of fossil fuel divestment and the financial reasons that Leslie will address next, the fossil fuel divestment movement has been growing globally. Back in 2014, divestment pledges were estimated at about $52 billion. Jumping ahead to 2021, they leapt to over 40 trillion in assets globally, this is, from both individuals and institutions committed to both full and partial divestment from fossil fuels. Full divestment is the goal, and sometimes it happens in stages, which is where that partial investment comes along. Okay. So it's impressive to see who is divesting: governments, educational systems, foundations, religious groups, pension funds, and more. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund offers a compelling example of divestment. While founded thanks to profits from oil, in 2014, the fund announced it would divest from fossil fuels. By the time the public announcement that they would divest was made, the fund's leadership had already grown accustomed to the divestment plan. So it no longer felt so surprising to them, even as this announcement came as a shock to the world. The fund's leadership explained that what seemed wrong to them would be to continue to invest in fossil fuels that undercut the fund's commitment to a sustainable world. And that sentiment, that desire to ensure that how we make money reflects our values, just as how we spend our money does. And that view is spreading. In another example, as a group, right before the COP26 climate talks, Auckland, Copenhagen, Glasgow, Paris, Rio de Janeiro, and Seattle all made divestment announcements, as did 72 faith-based organizations. In 2020, New York State, with the third largest pension fund in the United States, shared that it would begin divesting from fossil fuels. 1 year later, New York City announced its divestment plans. And Howard University, which got a lot of coverage, well, it took about a decade of staunch organizing, but ultimately its endowment managers came forward and said they don't intend to make direct investments in companies that develop fossil fuels. Instead, they're going to make a shift, including legacy investments that they will be liquidating. Next slide. Thanks. So in addition to examining the investments you make for their climate impacts, you'll undoubtedly also want to understand and address the climate impacts of basic banking. I'm sure you are already aware that the biggest bank funders of fossil fuels in the world are the four big US banks: Chase, the worst bank in the world for the climate, followed by Citi, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America. Since the Paris Climate Agreement, their fossil fuel financing has come to over $1 trillion. And just released today, this morning, the 2023 edition of Banking on Climate Chaos report documents how the 60 biggest banks in the world have poured $5.5 trillion into the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Climate Agreement. $673 billion in financing was provided last year alone. And for anyone joining us today from Canada, I'm afraid the Royal Bank of Canada did the most fossil fuel financing in 2022. The good news, however, is that you don't have to bank at an institution that is driving the climate crisis as a major financier and underwriter of fossil fuels, including, at this very moment in time, the expansion of the fossil fuel sector. Incredibly, fossil fuel exploration and development has not ended. Listed here are several websites that feature banks and credit unions that focus on local community development or that have a fossil fuel-free commitment or that are owned by and predominantly serve communities of color. There are many to choose from, including digital platforms as well as brick and mortar institutions. Aligning your banking with the climate is a great first step in greening your financial life. There are searchable tools from Bank of America, Green America, Bank for Good, Bank Green, Mighty Deposits, and betterbankingoptions.com. So I frequently hear from people that they never really thought about the breadth of banking options available to them. But once they learn about community development financial institutions, minority depository institution, and green banks, making the switch becomes an important step in living their green values. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. Some amazing information there. And I do imagine that Green America's tools on this are better than Bank of America's tools on this particular subject. We're going to turn things over to Leslie in a second. But before we do, I wanted to ask one follow-up question, Fran, to you. And that is, in what sectors are we seeing the most fossil fuel divestment? You're muted, Fran.
So the new report that I mentioned that just came out this morning, Banking on Climate Chaos, shows support for the expansion of fossil fuels, offshore oil and gas, and fracking to be at the very top.
Great. Okay, so Fran provided a lot of really great information with an emphasis on the moral reasons to divest from fossil fuels. So let's turn to the financial ones. And on that, I will hand the mic over to Leslie. You're muted, Leslie.
Thanks, Gigi. And hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today. As was mentioned, I'm the president of the Green Century Funds. We are one of the first families of fossil fuel-free mutual funds, and we've been doing environmental and sustainable investing for over 30 years. So on to the financial reasons. The first is something called stranded assets. So coal, oil, and gas companies are valued partially on their reserves. That is the fossil fuels that are still in the ground. And if the companies aren't able to extract them and burn them for whatever reason, regulation, litigation, some lawsuits, they may be forced to write off those assets, essentially effectively stranding them. And those actions can negatively affect a company's valuation or share price. The second reason is volatility. The energy sector has been one of the most volatile sectors in the last decade, and volatility can come from investing in fossil fuels. So investing may affect volatility. And the last is around performance, which you can see here on our chart. And on the chart, you can see there are two lines, and the blue line is the line of an index that does not have fossil fuels. And the yellow line is the same index of stocks, but it does have fossil fuels. And you can see that much of the time, the blue index without fossil fuels had stronger performance. I have found this to be a very helpful chart, especially if you're talking with others about performance. And so I'm glad we are both mailing and emailing it out to people, but it's also available in the new guide that is coming out that we've produced.
Okay, so now that we've learned something about compelling moral and financial reasons to consider divesting, Leslie, how is it that I know if I am invested in fossil fuels, and what are the key steps to take if I don't want to be?
Yep, let's get into it. So first, to find out if you're invested in fossil fuels, if you have a mutual fund or ETF that you own, you can go to that ETF or mutual fund's website and look up the holdings. You can also do that through morningstar.com, or if you go on Fidelity, even if you don't use Fidelity, if you type in the ticker or the name of the fund, you can get more information on it. And what you want to look for is something called the sector. It also can be called the category, the exposure, or the composition. They all mean the same thing. They're talking about the 13 different sectors or categories. And they were listed alphabetically from basic materials down through utilities. What you want to look for is the energy category. If there's a 0% in the energy category, it means that the fund or ETF does not hold traditional energy companies, including coal, oil, and gas. I want to assure you that renewable energy companies, for whatever reason, are not counted in energy. They show up in different sectors. So you're not eliminating renewable energy companies if you have a 0% there. The second step, though, is you want to then investigate your options. And before you start, you want to decide what is your definition of fossil fuel free, because there isn't a regulated term or a legal term on it. And it's changed a little bit. So at the start of the movement, as Fran was mentioning, the ask was to not invest in the top 200 companies that had the most fossil fuel reserves. What we found at the Green Century Funds was that if people didn't want to be in the top 200 companies, they likely didn't want to be in company 201 or 202. So our screening, or how we exclude fossil fuels, is more than that. It is any companies that explore, extract, process, refine, or transmit coal, oil, and gas. That's kind of the biggest part. But to capture any companies that might come through that screen, we also eliminate any companies that have proven carbon reserves. Those are those reserves that are still under the ground, as well as any utilities that burn fossil fuels to make electricity. And so this is, for Green Century, the core part of what fossil fuel free investing is. But as the movement has grown over the last 10 years, some organizations have also called for expanding the definition by, for example, avoiding investments in the banks that provide the most financing to the fossil fuel companies. And as Fran mentioned, there's a new report just out this morning that lists those top banks. And so you could also include that in your definition if you like. And then the next step is that you actually go and look for investments. So if you're interested in investing in mutual funds or ETFs that only invest in clean energy, you can look for those. If you're interested in mutual funds that are fossil fuel free, but include some clean energy, those exist as well. So for example, Green Century has an international fund that includes a holding in Vestas. It's one of the largest wind turbine companies in the world. One way to search is that you can search on a directory at an organization called US SIF. You hit the button called Mutual Funds and ETF Directory, and you look under the screening tab. And it's a long list of funds, and what you want to look for in the column is the funds that have an asterisk next to them. Those are the funds that have self-reported as being fossil fuel free. But what I also want to say is that you want to look at these different tools out there and searches, but it is also up to you to look a little bit under the hood and check out those sector analysis and the sectors around the energy sector and make sure it is matching up with what you're looking for. And while you're at it, if you are looking for fossil fuel free investments, you also might want to look for options that avoid other industries that you don't want to be supporting, such as tobacco, guns, nuclear energy, military weapons, or whatever issues are of most concern. A number of the fossil fuel free funds also include those exclusions. And then the third step is to reinvest. If you decide to divest, you can begin with those investments that you have, and you should contact your financial advisor or tax consultant before you make any investment changes. But if you do choose to make a new investment, for example, a new IRA contribution, then you can open an account same way you'd open any other investment account, directly with the mutual fund or ETF, through an investing platform like Fidelity or Schwab, or through your advisor. And I want to give you the friendly reminder that IRA contributions for 2023, IRA contributions for 2022 are due by Tuesday, April 18th. That is just around the corner. So you can still get in your 2022 contribution. And while you're at it, you also could do your 2023 contribution. So you don't have to remember to do that. And that's actually one of the reasons for the timing in this webinar, because we know a lot of people are just waiting for that deadline to make their new investments in their IRA. And then finally, I just want to note that if you're moving money in retirement accounts, such as an IRA, so you can move from different funds in your IRA, or even rolling over money from a 401k from a previous employer, that's something you can do. You're not necessarily stuck with the investments that you may not want in that 401k. This may not be a taxable event. Again, check with your financial advisor or tax consultant to find out.
Great, that's a lot of information that people were asking about various resources that have been mentioned in both Leslie and Fran's presentations, which we have so far dropped into the chat. So the report that Fran was referencing, that link is in the chat, and US SIF, the charts that Leslie was mentioning, that link is now in the chat. One more question I have for you, Leslie, is as more investors have become interested in aligning their investments with their concerns about global warming, we've seen an increase in greenwashing, or the practice of portraying investments as greener than they are. Matt mentioned this at some level from an advocacy point of view, but I'm interested, and I think our attendees here are interested in hearing about that more from an investments point of view. So can you explain what this is from this side of the fence, and how an investor might spot a greenwashed investment opportunity?
Sure, absolutely. So greenwashing, again, is just the practice of making a misleading statement or making some unsubstantiated claim. In this case, it's to make the investments appear to be either green or fossil fuel free when they may not be. So the top tip I have is to look beyond the name of the fund. The SEC has been cracking down, and firms have been renaming their funds, but there have been instances where if you looked at the title, you would think it might hold something different. And so you have to go beyond that. And again, you're going to go look for the sectors that are invested in those products. You can do that again just through those websites or through Morningstar or Fidelity or other platforms where you can look it up, and then align with what your definition is. A few names, and they keep coming, but the ones that to be careful of right now, one is fossil fuel reserves free. So this goes back to talking about those carbon reserves that are still under the ground. So this might allow you to avoid companies that have those reserves, but not all fossil fuel companies have reserves. So you still might be invested in fossil fuel companies. So keep that in mind. Something called low carbon, climate conscious. I'm not sure what the next name will be, but those kinds of names mean that there are different methodologies each firm uses to define what they mean to be low carbon or climate conscious. And they may be fossil fuel free, but it also might follow a different strategy. And so you really, again, just need to look under the hood and find out if it's what you want. And then finally, ESG, which I'm sure people have heard about by this point. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. ESG now is used by firms and the media to describe a really wide array of investments under that umbrella. At Green Century, we use ESG criteria to potentially avoid risk and enhance performance, but it is not how we get to be fossil fuel free, for example. So we have different screens, these exclusionary screens that take out industries that are environmentally harmful. And so an ESG product does not necessarily include those screens. And unless the fund explicitly says it's avoiding fossil fuels in its prospectus, it may not be. So those are all the things to watch out for. Reading the prospectus is, I know it's a big document and not everyone goes to it, but it does tell you what those exclusions might be and how those exclusions work. There are some more tips in our new guide, The Future Can Be So Bright, that go through some other examples that can help you when you're looking for, and if you're looking for new investments or to switch yours.
Great, thanks so much, Leslie and Fran and Matt. We are very much at the end of our sort of planned presentations, and we want to go to questions, some of which have been coming in via the chat, some of which were sent to us in advance of today's webinar. But I do want to highlight the guide that we are releasing today, as well as some other resources. So Green Century and Green America, Green Century Funds and Green America have collaborated to put together a updated version of a guide to fossil fuel free and sustainable investing. The future can indeed be bright. So this guide is available on Green Century's website, and we will also provide links to it in our follow-up correspondence from today's webinar. The organizations that are represented here also have a wealth of information. That's US PIRG, the organization that Matt works for, Green America, the organization that Fran works for, and Green Century, the organization that Leslie works for. All three of those websites have significant resources to add to today's conversation. So we do have to show you one very boring slide, which is next, and then we will go to questions that have come in over the course of the conversation today. I actually want to start, Matt, with a question that was posed sort of early that I'm not sure everybody saw. In your presentation, you had a slide that showed financing decreases over the last 2 years. And the question from the audience was, is this a result of divestment activism?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think the newest number from last year is still on that trend of slightly declining. And I think a lot of that has to do with divestment activism, and some of it has to do with stronger global commitments and policies to shift investments away from fossil fuels. I will say, promising that the trend, that it looks like on the chart, at least, that it peaked a couple of years ago and it's coming back down. But not at the level that we would hope or expect or need. And so I think lots more work to do, but a hopeful trend.
Great. Okay. I'm going to pivot to Fran. Question came in advance of the webinar. And again, we really appreciate people's level of engagement with our conversation today. The question was, I am hoping to have some practical steps on how to begin having this discussion with our congregation's trustees and board. Any practical resources making the case why this is important will be very helpful. So can you speak to that?
Great, thank you. Yes, there are many resources. Obviously, I'm going to say, please begin by checking out Green Century's new guide on fossil fuel-free investing, as well as the Green America website. We've already mentioned the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investing has all kinds of research on various facets of sustainable investing, from funds to shareholder advocacy to community development investing. It has all the strategies. You might also want to look at other endowment holders, like the Intentional Endowments Network. That might be something to explore their resources. And in addition, since you had mentioned this is a faith-based group, definitely connect with organizations like Green Faith. Green Faith does a lot of work on climate and banking issues. So that way you would be part of a community who's asking these same questions and working with religious leaders interdenominationally. And then I would also say to please look at your own denomination's resolutions that have been passed in prior years and commitments to creation care that probably already make the case and form the foundation for moving ahead on sustainable investing.
Okay, great. Switching gears a little bit, a question that has come in live is, I see Green Century does a lot of shareholder advocacy. Does this work with fossil fuel companies? So Leslie, can you take that one?
Sure. That is a common question about, is it better to hold them and try to change them, or do you divest? And as a mutual fund family that used to have gas companies, I speak from experience here in that shareholder advocacy is a useful tool, and we do a lot with other companies on plastic reduction and setting greenhouse gas goal reduction and getting rid of medically important antibiotics. But you can't change a core business through shareholder advocacy. You can change policies and practices. And so it's like getting Starbucks to stop serving coffee. Like it doesn't really work. And our work with gas companies, like you get them to cap a drilling well, but then they would have unlined pits where they put toxic water that affects aquifers. So after 7 years of doing that, we decided that we were going to fully divest. We never had coal or major oil, but we got rid of the gas companies too. And so my other favorite, and then I can wrap this up, but my other favorite is like, sure, you know, the argument is like, oh, well, you get a seat at the table. And, you know, the seat at the table you get is at the kids' table in the next room. And they close the door sometimes. So it is, I appreciate the shareholders that are trying to change the company, but if you are really trying to join a bigger movement in terms of affecting the political climate and the pressure that those companies are facing, you know, we've chosen to go the full divestment route. And as all of Fran's statistics, I think, were very inspiring to show how many other people have joined in that place.
Great. We've had a couple of questions come in that are in a similar vein. So a recently posted one that says, I've had a hard time finding investment advisors willing to accommodate a desire to invest in accordance with ESG principles. And then another one that is what to say to your family or financial advisor who isn't on board with this. So either Leslie or Fran, what would you say in response to those things?
Sure, I'm happy to hop in. It sounds like having an SRI dedicated financial advisor is what's needed, not someone who needs convincing, or not someone, to Leslie's point, that's using green investing or something that sounds like that more as a marketing pitch. It sounds like what you need is someone who is already fully on board and is an expert in socially responsible investing and really understands the full breadth of products and services that are available. So in order to find such an advisor, I would recommend going to some of the longtime, well-established national networks of advisors with this level of specialized expertise. And they include networks like Natural Investments, First Affirmative Financial Network, Progressive Asset Management. You know, you want to make sure that the burden of doing all the education about SRI is not falling onto you.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead, Leslie. Do you want
Right.
to?
No, I echo what Fran is saying. There are resources on the Green America site, as well as in the guide. There's some links to specifically be able to find financial advisors, just because we're not allowed to specifically recommend them, but there are a growing number of them out there. So don't give up. Just find them, interview them. Advisors work for you. So if they're not doing what you want, then you can just change. Because there are a growing number of dedicated advisors, and even just people who are very dedicated to fossil fuel free investing, who work with individuals, families, institutions, and they're out there and they would love to help you.
And just to add on, I think there was a second part to the question. So there's about advisors, the professionals, but then what about your family members? And it really is an educational and listening process. You really want to understand what are the concerns about it. And there are a lot of myth-busting resources out there. So for a long time, it's been thought, wow, you're going to sacrifice returns. All right, well, then let's have a discussion. Let's look at the real data. Let's look at the data that speaks to performance nationally as well as globally. You know, how can you provide answers to the questions or the hesitancies that you see that family members are having? And I think it's really important to take the time to listen and to fully engage, and not to just sort of ram through, wow, we want to shift our portfolio and we want to do it this way. You want to make sure that your family members who would be impacted by this decision are on board and understand and come to embrace this approach to where their assets are invested.
That pivots pretty nicely to a question that came in before the webinar. So I'll just pose it as a follow-up, Fran, to what you were saying. And that question was, can you really make a good investment, i.e. make money in a socially responsible company? So that speaks right to the heart of the kinds of questions that you get from family members, friends, and maybe your financial advisor. So I think we've mostly answered that question, but Leslie, would you have a sort of direct answer to that you could provide to people who are wondering how to navigate the conversation from here?
Sure. I think that if anyone promises that you're going to make money in any investment, you should not ever invest in that, probably, or find a new financial advisor, because none of it is guaranteed. And using ESG or sustainability criteria can impact it. It could be positive or negative. And so I'm very restricted in being able to say it, but I would again point to the chart. I would look at the track record of investments in the past, not just in the last year and a half, because as you know, the fossil fuel free industry has been reaping enormous profits in the last year and a half, but take a longer look, as you should for all investments, over a 3 to 5 to 10 year period, and just compare for yourselves. And then I think, come back to the idea of, why you joined the webinar, and try to explain to the people who you're trying to convince that investments are an extension of your values or morals, and something you do, just like you recycle or bike or put on solar panels. And there doesn't need to be a wall between all of that lifestyle choices and your investments. And I think that was the kind of most successful way to do it. And if it's not all of your money, you could start with the portion of it. That might be an appropriate way that people are more comfortable with taking that first step.
Great. I'll also pull out something that's in the chat, but just in case you didn't see it, one of our panelists that's helping to field questions in the background, Aaron Gray from the Green Century team, it noted that US CIF has a list of members, some of which are investment advisors, and other firms that focus, again, to the question of my financial advisor is not on board with this. Other financial advisors are, and firms that focus on ESG or socially responsible investing include First Affirmative Financial Network and Natural Investments. So those are also a couple of firms that you can go to. Okay, so we are nearing the end of our time. I want to take us into a different direction for one question, and that is, this again came in ahead of the webinar. Personally want to shun all nuclear development, having been anti-nuke for the last 50 years. Care to comment? And Fran, why don't you take that one?
Sure. My organization as well, Green America, does not support nuclear energy either. So I would say, yes, when examining the prospectus of funds that you are interested in, you'll want to look for a nuclear energy exclusion. Just as, you might look for exclusions around weaponry, handguns, animal cruelty. I mean, there's like all levels there, tobacco. I mean, there are many, many different types of exclusions, as well as positive inclusion of particular types of companies and issues that would meet your goals.
Great. Okay, well, we are at the 50-minute mark. So I think that is a wrap for this webinar. If we didn't get to your question, either in the presentation itself or in the follow-up, then we will do our best to address that question in our follow-up after today's session. My name again is Gigi Norcross, and it's been my pleasure to moderate this panel. I have just put my email address into the chat, so feel free to copy that and send any questions that you might have my way, and then I will either answer or I will forward it to one of our esteemed panelists so that they can engage with you more. The fact that you are here, it means that you have interest in figuring out whether it is appropriate for you to align your environmental concerns with your investment choices, and that you are more broadly concerned about the ever-growing problem of global warming. So we appreciate your participation so much, and thanks again for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
You.
Thanks for tuning in.